Welcome to a new edition of the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino. On this episode, we talk with war veteran, author, military analyst, and historian Matthew Reed. As someone who spent most of the best years of his life in the military intelligence profession working on behalf of the Defense Department and multiple nations overseas, he has garnered a wealth of experience and perspectives that are rarely matched. He has used his extensive military experiences to write a series of unique, controversial, and highly original novels that are unlike any others that are out on the market today. He's got a fascinating story all around. Enjoy this interview.
Hi, Matthew.
How you doing?
Hey, I'm good. How's life?
Going pretty good. I can't complain.
Good. Hey, thanks for taking a minute out. I appreciate it.
Oh, not at all. No worries.
So you are a busy man, and I'm curious, before we get into your life and what you exactly do, how did you survive COVID? How did that time change you now that we're kind of coming out of it and the world's waking up a little bit?
Well, I was actually mostly overseas for the whole thing. I was working as a DoD contractor over in southeastern Europe, and I just, kept doing my job for the most part. I mean, obviously the pandemic had some effect on it. Some of the things that I was doing were kind of tamped down, but no, we all got by okay. All of the contractors who were working overseas. Yeah, it didn't do me any damage. I mean, I just kind of, kept working overseas and just went through it until my position got cut by the Department of Defense, and then, me and a few other guys got sent home packing.
On paper, there's a lot going on with you, and I'm curious, if you were in front of a bunch of fifth graders at a career fair at school, and one of them looks up at you and says, "What do you do for a living?" How would you answer them?
I would tell them I'm a career intelligence professional in the U.S. military intelligence community. I've done a lot of things for Uncle Sam. Some I can talk about, some I can't. But I've gotten a chance to do some pretty, important things, some stressful things. But most recently, I worked as a counterintelligence analyst, and my job there was actually to chase spies from hostile intel services to stop them doing damage to the country. And while I can't talk about too many of the details right now, it's definitely been worth it. I wouldn't change a thing.
If we go back in your life to your childhood and arrive where you're at, I mean, you're obviously a highly driven individual, amassing quite a bit of mental and physical strength. What was it about your childhood that led you to this point of wanting to pursue a career in the military and being a writer and doing what you do?
So it was a number of things. It started when I was very young. So when I was, maybe 4 or 5 years old, we were actually living in Gonzales, Louisiana. And that was when I found out sort of on accident that we're going through some of my father's things, and my father had been in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. I saw a lot of his pictures from the war. And I kind of knew a little bit about what it was. I, saw some things on television, and I got my dad to open up and talk a little bit about it. And as I got to know him better growing up, and then my grandfather, who was also a World War II veteran, showed me a lot of things that, he had from his past time in World War II, his time as a tail gunner on a B-25 Mitchell. Had quite a few interesting stories. They'd both been kind of a part of history, at least the military side of history. And my father and my grandfather both encouraged me to read a lot of books, especially ones that were focused on any kind of history, military, economic, demographic, geographic, you name it. And my grandfather was real big on not just studying the military history of Europe because, he had fought there for, 3.5, 4 years or so. Some important years of his life were spent fighting the German Wehrmacht. And he also encouraged me to study ancient Roman military history, the history of the Roman Empire, the Roman legions. And doing all that, I really, really enjoyed it. And I felt like I learned a lot. And I sometimes used to, catch myself thinking, okay, what would it have been like to be one of those Roman legionaries, in a battlefield in Britain or Parthia or north of the Danube in modern-day Romania? And I thought, what was it like to be my father and my grandfather? So that kind of led me towards a career in the military. And from there, after college, I did 4 years in the Marine Corps. Then I did 3.5 years in the Army. got a couple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan in uniform, and when I got out of the Army, I decided to stay working in the intelligence community, but just doing it as a contractor for the Department of Defense, and I spent, well, an additional 5 years in Afghanistan, and then just about those 6 years in Southeastern Europe and the Balkans, Kosovo, Macedonia, Serbia, places like that. So that's kind of the summation of it.
You know, it's amazing whenever I hear all of these countries that you've mentioned, just how much your eyes have been opened up to how the rest of the world works. I mean, if more people could experience different cultures and how things work, how does that change the way that you look, like, at the world, like empathy-wise and understanding things? I mean, just seeing different cultures and societies. How important has that been for you in your development as a human being?
I have to say it's pretty important. So when I first deployed overseas, first overseas stop after we had a little, filling up with fuel in Germany, we went down to Ali Al Salim Air Base in Kuwait. So Kuwait was the first stop. Then, of course, it was there into Diyala province in northern Iraq. And it really does change you in a lot of different ways. And so you have a chance, you see how other people live. And if you study the history of a region, say the history of Mesopotamia, and I had at least as far as the Roman Empire goes when it was called Parthia, I got a chance to see a lot of these places that I had read about. And it was kind of interesting. It was like pieces of a puzzle. I knew the history, and when I saw how the people lived, I saw how they fought each other and how they fought against us. And it was like all these different pieces just start clicking into place. I sort of thought that I had maybe just a little bit of a better understanding of why the people over there, why our opponents, our adversaries were the way they were, why they fought the way they do, how their history shaped them, and then having a chance to see that, and then go to Afghanistan for a number of years, see those societies in Kosovo and the Balkans. It did actually give me a much greater appreciation for, what we have here in the United States, where we do have an independent court system. We do still have a very strong tradition of a rule of law. And you go to countries where that's not the case, where it's not about the value or the rights of the individual person, which is something that's really hardwired into us at a very deep level. We go to other countries, like especially Afghanistan, it's all about the family and the tribe, and loyalty to nation or individual rights just isn't even an afterthought. And so having a chance to see what that can do to a society, what that type of crippling corruption does, and then seeing how, yes, we obviously have corruption in the United States. Nothing's ever perfect. But with an independent court system and a rule of law, it's kept to a minimum, and any individual person who is unfairly targeted, so on and so forth, they do have a way to fight back. In other countries, if you're not a member of the junta or whatever organized crime family is controlling the country, whether that's Kosovo, Iraq, or Afghanistan, you just don't have a snowball's chance in hell. And the idea of there being respect for individual rights in many cases is just totally antithetical to their way of thinking. And in addition to learning that, having to match with some of our adversaries in places like Southeastern Europe, where we were mostly going up against the Russians, my job was to stop them from penetrating our intelligence operations. I had a chance to see how they operated, not just against us, but on their own soil. And what unchecked government power can do over a long enough period of time, it really opened my eyes to the dangers of that, though I've studied about it in history. You can read about it all you want to, but until you actually see it, it doesn't really make a truly deep impression on you until you actually you put the pieces together and you go, oh wow, that historian Barry Strauss or Michael Grant when they wrote about this, or Solzhenitsyn. Okay, wow, these guys really knew what they were talking about. So he gave me a whole appreciation for a whole host of things that perhaps here in the United States we take for granted.
So when you were a kid, did you always envision that your life would turn out like this? You would get in the military, you would write. What was your vision when you were a kid?
Wow. I had a lot of different visions. It kind of was fluid, never really stayed the same. I just had a general idea within a certain set of guidelines, specifically of what I wanted to do. So I knew I wanted to go serve in the military, active duty. I wanted to go live the life of a Marine and a soldier. I knew I wanted to deploy overseas to some sort of combat action, to some sort of war where I would do my job for real. That never really changed. And there were times when I thought, okay, I'll stay a career in the military. Maybe I'll become a general someday, like, General Patton, Curtis LeMay, Omar Bradley, so on and so forth. And the time I spent in the military and the way that the wars were going in Iraq and Afghanistan, and again, being a historian, I was literally watching history repeat itself. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, that is not something I'm probably ever going to be able to accomplish. There are some cases where in order to make it to those higher ranks, sometimes you have to compromise your beliefs or your principles, and that was just not something I was willing to do. And I thought to myself, okay, I like the intelligence side of things, the interrogation, the spy thing, the counterintelligence operations. That's what I actually really liked doing that. It was a pretty exciting thing, in spite of how nasty and dangerous it could be at times, depending on where you were sent. And when I decided to go become a contractor after getting out of the Army. I said, okay, this is the career path I'm on, and I'm just going to keep following this particular path and just run it out until I'm too old to do it anymore.
Who has been a hero for you? Who's been a role model in your life that you've always looked up to?
Oh, quite a few people. So there was obviously my father and my grandfather growing up. I had a lot of good, positive male role models. My father, my grandfather, one of my uncles, all good men. And as far as other people I looked up to that I obviously never met, there were a lot of figures throughout history that I enjoyed reading about, particularly, say, the Roman Empire, a lot of the great Roman generals. I mean, not just Julius Caesar. Everybody knows who he is, more or less. But Roman generals like Gaius Corbulo, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Aurelian, all these military commanders who sort of had an idea of what they wanted to do in their career, and then the circumstances they found themselves in, they had to adapt and improvise very, very quickly and correct course to protect the various empires they were in charge of securing. And then, of course, I looked up to men like George S. Patton, Matthew Ridgway, men who were kind of mavericks in their line of work. And then career intelligence officers, a famous Army intel officer, for example, named Colonel Philip Corso. Now, he wrote a book called The Day After Roswell. I read a lot about him, and then when I got in the Army, I was able to access things like the old military intelligence archives and see a lot more about what he did in the Second World War. And I really admired what that man was able to achieve as a counterintelligence officer in Rome during World War II, where he was literally having to secure Allied intelligence operations from both the Soviets, who were supposed to be our allies, and from the Germans, the Nazi SS, and so forth. And having those men to sort of look up to and model myself after, whenever I found myself in tough times, like when I was in the Army working overseas, thinking, okay, I'm in a tough situation here, and I could always think back and say, okay, how did so-and-so deal with this problem? And thinking about that didn't necessarily give me the exact procedure or the exact thing to do, but it at least showed me what direction I could go. And as long as I did that, I never went wrong.
So you talked about being an avid reader. Was there a book in particular that really kind of parted the curtains for you that you go back to, that you really, it either made you want to write or it made you want to read more?
Oh, there's actually a fair number of books that fit that bill. So on the history side, a lot of the things that I read about the Roman Empire are books like The Fall of the Roman Empire by Michael Grant. It's an excellent book where he's laying out every single factor that led to the empire's fall, economic and military policy-wise. And he does it in such a way that's very concise that if you wanted to see where a great power or a great nation is about to start making serious mistakes, he shows you clearly what we in the intel community would call the indicators. Meaning when you start seeing A, B, and C happen, it's only a matter of time before, say, E, F, and G happen, that kind of thing. So that influenced me. And then one other book that I read that actually made me want to actually write fiction. It was a book by a man named Gustav Hassford. And Gustav Hassford, a lot of people don't know this, he wrote a book about his time in Vietnam in the Marine Corps. It was called The Short Timers. And that book was made into a movie called Full Metal Jacket. And Hassford's books, he wrote Short Timers and a sequel called The Phantom Blooper, and then another fictional novel called A Gypsy Good Time. He's an excellent writer, very underappreciated. I read his books and the way he wrote, and I thought, I can write like this. And so when I was in college, I just put pen to paper in my free time and tried to write a few stories, and I actually got a few written. My friends enjoyed reading. They said, hey, Matt, you're a good writer, man. You ought to stick with this. I mean, some of the stuff you're writing, this is good stuff. So I did that periodically over the years, and then only in recent history I wrote a number of books and novels and novellas that I got published through the Amazon Kindle Direct Publishing Program. I actually finished 3 short ones when I was still working over in Kosovo. The KDP program is efficient enough to where you can actually work overseas, and as long as you have an internet connection, you can do it. So those books, Gus Hassford's books and the history books those history books and Gus Hassford's books really were what did it for me.
How much of what you do in your work with the military, now and historically, how much of that becomes material for you or inspiration for you in your books?
Oh, quite a bit of it, let me tell you. A huge chunk of what goes into my books is based on my experiences in the military, in military intelligence, the things I did overseas as a contractor. And one of the things that entails is when I write some of these books, I have to sometimes send them off to the Pentagon to get them cleared for publication. For example, one of my more recent books is a military sci-fi thriller called The Time Killers. It's a time travel thriller. And that one I had to send to the Pentagon's Publication Review Office and get at least one additional 3-letter agency to sign off on it. And I was quite surprised because I thought for sure they would redact a lot of things out, issues that I alluded to out in the American Southwest regarding certain classified military installations. But I was surprised. They came back and they said, hey, Mr. Reed, we're okay with it the way it is. The tradecraft you use in here is not so detailed that it really gives anything away, and they were okay with it. Other books, like In the Death of Night 2.0, that more goes into the things I learned in the Marine Corps regarding infantry tactics and explosives and demolitions, and then certain Russian-made weapons like fuel air explosive rockets, RPGs, that sort of thing. A lot of that went into that book as far as details about how you really employ them, what those weapons actually do, what their capabilities are, and how they actually do damage. It's very realistic, as a lot of people who have read it that I served with are like, wow. They're like, Matt, this just made me feel like I was back on one of the firing ranges. So all my experiences, they definitely feature very, very heavily in all my books.
So what's been one of the best fan letters you've ever gotten from one of your books?
So not so much a fan letter, but I've gotten some email feedback. So I had one gentleman who just emailed me, found my author email on my Amazon page, and he emailed me back about 2 of my books that he read, and he says, wow, man, he says, this thing was good. He said, I couldn't put it down. and he liked the action. This was Time Killers he had read. He liked the action, the graphic love scenes. He obviously loved those. And I had another gentleman who was active duty military who emailed me back, told me how much he enjoyed my books, but then also asked me about, what are some good history books to read on the Roman Empire, because I had a previous podcast appearance on the Cleared Hot podcast, and that got a lot of people's attention in a few places. But those are probably the two best fan mails I ever got, just guys telling me how much they loved it, and hey, when are you writing more books?
So you probably very absolutely know, based on your acumen in the military and history, history tends to be kind of a carousel, kind of goes back around, and everything kind of repeats itself. Is what is happening with Russia and the Ukraine any different from any of these other countries that have tried to go into other countries throughout the history of battles and things along those lines? Is this pretty rote for what happens?
So there's a lot of similarities. To give you an example. So what goes on between Russia and Ukraine, it has really deep military historical roots. So how should I start? So for a number of centuries, going back to about the 18th century, every existential invasion that has come against Russia has come from the West, come from Europe. They've always been kind of a little bit paranoid. During World War II, the Nazis invaded, and the Russians lost about 27 million people trying to fight them off. The only people who probably suffered worse were actually the Ukrainians, and the Russians, in some cases, used the Ukrainians as cannon fodder fighting against the Nazis and the German Wehrmacht. They'd round up civilians, make them run through minefields, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of anger and enmity that's gone back and forth over the centuries. Well, there was times when the Ukrainians would get in bed with the Europeans, or the Russians would come in and just be, total dicks to them like they were in World War II and sometimes the immediate aftermath, even though some of their best military officers were actually Ukrainians, oddly enough. And so there's been a lot of that back and forth. And nations that usually go deep into the Asian steppe plain, basically Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine, they've always regretted it. Pretty much every great imperial military force the Europeans have fielded since about the 15th century, going into that area, Russia and the Ukraine, is where they usually get their backs broken. And, of course, the most recent ones were the German Wehrmacht. But there's so much history behind what's going on in Russia and the Ukraine. For example, the Russian military considers it a strategically vital area because it helps them insulate themselves from what they think could always be a future invasion. And the Ukraine, that general area, is actually where the Russian Red Army broke the back of the German Wehrmacht in World War II. We weren't the ones who actually, snapped their spine. The Russians did that in Ukraine at places like Stalingrad and the tank battle of Kursk. So they have their way of looking at Ukraine, where the Ukrainians are kind of caught in the middle. They kind of just want to maybe be their own country and just kind of be left alone to do their own thing. And once again, with Russia coming in and invading the U.S. and Europe, giving them weapons to push back against the Russians, you're kind of seeing history repeat itself where they're caught in the middle between two great power structures. So there's quite a bit of history there, and as far as what the Russians might do, there's a high probability what the Russians might actually do because of all the losses they sustain and winters coming up. They may pull back a little bit, and they may try to retrench during the winter, lick their wounds, and then come back hard, which is what they did against Napoleon, that's what they did against the Poles, and it's what they did against the German Wehrmacht in World War II. Now, will they be as successful as they were back then when the Russians have got a very steep declining birth rate and they're struggling to find enough young men to fill out the army? I honestly don't know, but given their history repeating itself, they may pull back and retrench during winter time and then try to come back even harder when the winter's over.
So let's go into your history here with everything that you've lived through and seen. If you have a dream tonight and you run into a younger version of yourself, and you could give that 20-year-old version of yourself a piece of advice based on the wisdom that you've gained over all these years, what would you tell your younger version?
Oh, wow. Good question. I would probably tell my younger version of myself, don't get out of the Marine Corps, stay in longer, and try to do more tasks, more missions overseas. Next thing I would tell my younger self is, once you get into a good slot in the intelligence community, just stay in it. I would tell my younger self not to move around as much as I did.
So everyone has a perception of you, an idea of who they think you are, your family, your friends, your readers, colleagues, but you ultimately live your life. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Well, I'm a historian, a writer, and a career U.S. intelligence community specialist. And who I am is a guy who's got a particular mission that he wants to accomplish, and I'm going to keep trying to accomplish that mission in defense of the nation until I just run out of gas. But in the process, I want to write as many books as I can to be enjoyed by as many people as possible, but I also want to write books that have enough information in them to where I can maybe educate people on a few things here and there as far as why the intelligence community does the things it does overseas and why we behave the way we do. That's kind of my mission. Two-pronged.
So, Matt, yeah. So if anyone wants to pick up your books, learn more about what you do, where's the best place on the web for them to go?
Absolute best place is just to go to my Amazon author page. Just go to Amazon.com and type in, for example, one of the titles of my books, just type in The Time Killers by Matthew Reed. It'll pull the book up. You can pull it up, and then you click on my name. It'll have my Amazon author page. Another good site to go to is bookbub.com. I have an author page there. You just type in my name. It'll pull it up. It'll lay out my history in a little more detail of what I've done for the Department of Defense over the years, and it'll have all of my books. You can click on and order them. That easy.
Matthew, thank you for taking time out today, man. Good luck with everything. I appreciate it.
Not a problem, sir. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk with you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to another famous interview with Joe Dimino, where we cover the world of art, literature, and music around the globe. If you want to hear more interviews, visit the Famous Interviews with Joe Dimino channel on YouTube. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.